But let's look at day 2, or session 2, if you like that term better. We're going to look at the power of habits today. This is new. This has not been in the Rockstar Manifesto sessions before. But I think it's important. And to sort of kick it off, we have to look at where we started yesterday. The thing about habits, don't worry, we're gonna like fully get into this today. We're gonna talk about things like diet, we're gonna talk about things like sleep patterns, we're gonna talk about exercise, you're trying to work out, how do you best go about that? We're gonna talk about academics, finances, it all falls in the same sort of realm. But I think the thing that we have to kind of keep as our thesis is what we talked about yesterday in the first session, which is that if you want something to be healthy in your life, then you have to be purposeful and intentional about it, right? So if you want to change a habit, if you want to make your lifestyle better, like if you want to make 2022 the best year that you've had, then I think you have to evaluate the different aspects of your life. And I think it's also worth noting that you have various aspects in your life. So if you sit down and do like a self-inventory, and you're like, okay, so you've got these, there's one person I follow and they talk about like the 5 circles of the aspects of your life. And so if you're evaluating like where am I at financially, where am I at in my family relationships, how's my health, right? How are you spiritually, right? And how are you, with your family? So if you look at these 5 different areas of your life and you give yourself a rating, like from 1 to 10. So I think some of you would find like in the different aspects of your life, you might be killing it in some of them, right? Academically, you might be crushing it, right? And maybe you're like a 7 out of 10 or an 8 out of 10, and it's like you're in a good place. But maybe like in your personal life or your mental health, or maybe in your personal relationships, you might be like a 4. So the thing about being intentional and purposeful in your life is that you have to evaluate all the aspects of your life, right? Relationships are important. So if you want your relationships to be healthy, you have to be intentional and fill them with purpose, right? If you want your finances to be on point, you have to be intentional. You have to have a plan. You have to fill them with purpose, right? Because if you don't, they're going to atrophy and they're going to die, like we talked about yesterday. So this approach is the theme for the whole week, and we're going to take this approach and apply it to different kind of aspects. So today we're going to look at habits, and habits are a big part of who we are, right? It was Aristotle that said you are what you repeatedly do. So the thing is that it's hard to really realize the extent to which your little tiny micro decisions build up to create who you are, right? What you practice, you will get good at, right? So whatever you're doing in your day-to-day routines now is going to show up in later aspects of your life. And that's a mistake a lot of us make. We don't take certain things seriously. Like, so for instance, if your academic habits are just really not healthy, but you're getting by, you're looking at the outcome. Well, you need to look at the process because the outcome's not always going to be the same. So if your academic habits are not where they need to be, that's not going to help you next year. You're practicing something, you're getting good at it, and that's what you're going to continue to perpetuate. The same thing is true in your relationships. If you have unhealthy patterns in your relationships, but the outcome's not necessarily bad, it's just conditioning those behaviors, and they're going to continue. And that's a problem, right? So what you're doing today is kind of setting the stage or the precedent for tomorrow and next year and all that. So really kind of look at this lens of how do I be intentional about the things in my life that matter? If you want to learn how to get better sleep habits, okay, then how do we plan for this goal? If you want to, get into shape, how do we plan for this goal, right? Whatever your goal is. Yesterday we did a couple different goal setting exercises, and one of them I told you to write down a plan for 2022. Personal goal for this year, right? And so I think the thing that you have to look at is it's important to put those things down on paper, right? We put down a personal goal for 2022. We put down a financial goal for 5 years from today. And then you put down just a generic goal for 20 years from today in 2042. And I know that seems like a lot, like it's way too long term, and it's hard to like perpetuate those action steps for 20 years from now, but it is important to like manifest this. Let's make it real. Like if this is important, let's put it down on paper, right? Because research is pretty clear about this. It's kind of interesting. I'll drop a couple statistics on you today, but the first one is that I think is interesting is like you are 7 times more likely to complete a goal by writing it down, right? Instead of just keeping it in your mind. If nothing else is different, that's really kind of crazy to think about, right? 7 times more likely. There's a 70% greater chance that you'll actually achieve a goal just by writing it down. Right? So you go into business and they have vision boards and goal boards, and like, you have to put this stuff down. Like, you have to make a commitment to make it real. So if you want to take care of your body, if you want to take care of your mental health, if your goal yesterday was you need some margin in your life, right? You're too stressed out. You have neglected self-care. That's a great goal. But you have to put it down on paper and you have to create some action steps, right? So, okay, if this is going to be the year where you prioritize your mental health, how do you go about doing that, right? What are those action steps? We have to be purposeful. We can't just hope that it's going to happen. So your action step might be that maybe you need to cut some stuff out of your very limited time. Maybe one of your goals is you need to find some time to meditate. Maybe you need to connect with your spiritual beliefs. Maybe you need to cut some toxic relationships out of your life. Maybe you need to exercise and have a way to like burn off some steam. I don't know what it looks like for you, but put the goal down on paper, create some action steps, and let's get there, right? If your goal was, I want to be intentional about a financial education, right? You want to have a good marriage someday, but what are you doing to make sure that happens? You want to be rich. Lots of people say they want to be rich, but like, what are you doing to make sure that happens? Are you reading books? Are you listening to podcasts? Are you subscribing to people on social media? Are you talking to people who are doing it successfully? Right? So one of the quotes from yesterday was, that this idea that you can tell me what you're passionate about, but really, if we want to see what you're passionate about, we look at how you spend your time and how you spend your money. That tells us everything we need to know about what you care about, right? And if who you spend your time with tells us those relationships that are closest to you, the 5 closest relationships, they tell us what you're going to turn out like in the future. You're heading in the same direction they are. So that's the whole key here, is that we want to maintain this thesis, this theme of being intentional. Because if you neglect part of your life, like maybe you're crushing it in your academics, but you're neglecting your social life, well, then you're going to become complacent about that, and you're going to get comfortable, right? You're not putting intentionality into it, and before you know it, that's not going to be a very stimulated and fulfilling part of your life. Right? And you're going to start making compromises in the name of comfort, and you're going to avoid conversations that need to be had, or you're just not going to be a good friend. And eventually that's going to slip into something that's destructive, right? Best case scenario, it stays blah, right? So only what we pour attention into, purpose, and have a strategy for is going to thrive and flourish, right? So let's talk about habits, because habits happen unconsciously. We complacently slip into habits that we don't realize we have, right? So let's say, for instance, let's think about something like your finances, right? So let's say, for instance, that you had financial problems. I mean, obviously, I know you guys haven't reached a point in your life where you've probably made a bunch of financial mistakes, but let's say you rack up some credit card debt, and you're like, oh, I make X amount of money every month, and I have this much going out the door, and so you go to somebody and you're like, help me out. I want to do well. I want to break my financial bad habits, and I want to institute some good, positive financial habits. Well, one of the things they're going to do is they're going to sit down with you and they're going to ask you to map it out. Let's actually look at ourselves in the mirror. How much money do you spend? Right? So that's one way that you can shine some light on how to go forward and create a good habit, right? Or to eliminate a bad habit. So all through today's lecture, I'm just going to intersperse and go back and forth between creating good habits and making them stick, and how do we break those bad habits that are so hard to get rid of, right? Because I think one of the misconceptions here, when we get into what are the things that influence the habits and the decisions that we make, I think one of the misconceptions is people say things like, oh, well, I have this New Year's resolution and I want to do better at it, but I just don't have the willpower. That's a true statement, but none of us has the willpower to do something that's hard, right? That's why we slip back into complacency, because the default setting is not doing something. The easiest thing is to stay comfortable. So the willpower, or the lack thereof, is not really the problem. The problem is what we mentioned yesterday. It's discipline over motivation. If you want to institute a life change, a lifestyle change, a habit change, you need to create a disciplined plan. Not wait for the day that you're motivated to do it. So come up with a plan, put that plan into action, and stick with it, right? And it could be micro decisions, right? So let's look at the things that influence these habits. Good habits, bad habits, little micro decisions that become big long-term habits. right? There's really kind of three criteria we're going to look at today. The first thing that influences your decision making that turns into habits is your environment. You'll be surprised at how much your environment is structured into your decision making, right? For instance, like if you want to have better academic habits, you need to create an environment that's conducive to that, right? You need to create an environment where you can study, where you can read, right? You need to create an environment that's conducive to you concentrating. Maybe it's your financial environment, right? So you're trying to learn how to make good financial decisions because you want to be wealthy and you want to stay out of debt. So I think you would be surprised at the level that your environment influences these things, right? You have to create a conducive environment. Sometimes you're in a negative environment. Like I said, if you're learning bad financial habits from your models, which are whoever your guardians are, it's going to be difficult for you to break that pattern. That's why poverty is such a cyclical thing, right? If you have a bad example of what a healthy marriage looks like, it's going to be difficult for you to break that cycle because your environment influences those little decisions that you make, right? We are a product of our environments. So I think you have to really evaluate and be willing to be realistic about how much of these decisions are influenced by environmental factors. If your friends are a bad influence on your ability to study or time manage or whatever, you need to create some boundaries. Boundaries are healthy. We'll talk about boundaries in relationships on Friday. The whole thing is, if boundaries are there to keep things in check, then they're healthy, right? Because every time that you cross a boundary, that's a compromise that you're making. And that slips into destructive behaviors, right? So some of you probably need to create some boundaries in your time. Some of you need to create some boundaries in your friendships. Some of you need to create some boundaries with your parents, maybe. Whatever it is. But there are lots of things in your environment that can influence how you make decisions, right? And so you have to kind of identify those. Like, why do I have the relationship with food that I have? Why do I have the relationship with money that I have? Why do I have the relationship with stress that I have? Why do I have the relationship with whatever, toxic relationship traits that I have? Those are all environmental factors that you probably don't even recognize because they're like latent, they're dormant and below the surface. But you have to identify those things, right? So definitely environmental factors influence how we make decisions. But the second one is this, and you guys are pretty sensitive to this from a psychological standpoint, is your brain chemistry has a lot to do with how you make decisions. And we'll look at things like dopamine, behavioral rewards, and we'll look at stress and adrenaline and cortisol and how people do things like they stress eat, or they stress drink, or they self-medicate, or they shut down because they have panic, right? These are all very real physiological responses. And there's a biological cause for those. But understanding how your brain chemistry is incentivizing those decisions can also help you make better decisions. It can help you break bad habits too, right? Some of your bad habits are just dopamine addictions. And so we have to create friction on those. We have to identify the problem. We have to break that cycle, right? And then the third thing is your genetics. And there's not a whole lot you can do about your genetics, right? But you can be cognizant and be aware of your genetics. And this may not have the same day-to-day influence on your decisions, but it definitely can have an influence on your decisions, right? So if you're genetically predisposed to addiction and you slip into that cycle of addiction, that's a different fight for you, right? So some people are more dopaminergic people. Some people inherit genetic predispositions for alcoholism or drug abuse, and that's something that you can be aware of, right? If that's something you see running through your family, right? Metabolism problems, thyroid problems, whatever it is that might influence your ability to manage your weight might be genetic, right? Most of that is probably environmental, because then we get into this idea of like, well, what's my relationship with food? Your body type probably matches your parents. And so on one hand, you might say, okay, well, I inherited my body type from my parents. It's like in our genetics. But you also can't separate nurture, your environment. You're being influenced by the same people that have that body type. So their relationship with food, their relationship with exercise, that's going to influence things too. So sometimes it's more than one. Your environment, you're in a negative environment of people who have maybe like an unhealthy relationship with food or stress or whatever, fill in the blank. And then you couple that with the genetic predisposition. And that makes it an uphill climb, right? So we do have to be sensitive to the things that influence our habits, right? So if Aristotle's right and we are the product of our decisions, then we have to kind of identify the influences for those, right? So let's think about this. This is kind of our jumping off point, right? Some of you might be thinking, like, at this point in my life, why does it matter? Like, I can eat 4,000 calories a day and Chick-fil-A once a meal, or one meal a day for a whole week and not see any changes in your body. Or you can stay up all night and drink coffee to get through your school day and it not be a problem, right? But again, I'm going to use this metaphor because I like this metaphor financially. It makes more sense here to look at your decisions, right? Little tiny decisions are just practice for later. So just how compounded interest works in your finances, those compounded micro habits work in your decision making, right? So let me tell you what I mean. If compounded interest is kind of this interesting thing, let's say for instance that you take $100 and you put it into an account and you get 3% interest in addition to that $100. So what's 3% of 100? It's $3. So you make $103 after such amount of time. So you put $100 in an account, you get 3% interest for having it in that account, right? For the market or whatever kind of account it is. Now you have $103. And you're like, okay, that's not a big return. But this is how compounded interest works. You now have a new number, right? So now it's 3% of 103, right? It's not 3% of 100. So that as that number increases, the baseline increases, but the percentage stays the same, right? Your decision making is very similar also. It builds upon itself. It scaffolds, right? So your new habits become the new normal, and you go from there, your new habits, right? And it's in a negative thing too. Like that's the path of self-destruction. You make one compromise, and then that makes it easier to make that compromise again, and then it happens again, and then it happens again. And so let me kind of tell you one of the ways that you can combat that. One of the things that you look at is, okay, well, if I have a hard time creating a goal and continuing the habit, then create smaller goals. Put a smaller time period on it, right? One of the exercises that I've heard of before, right, from somebody who's like a business coach for other businesses or companies, is they do 10-day goals, and then they do 10-month goals. So think about this, right? Maybe your goal is I'm going to work out. Like 2020 is my year. or 2022 is my year. 2020 was no one's year. Okay, let's just get that off the table right now. That was no one's year. So 2022 is my year. I'm gonna start working out. I'm gonna take care of my body. So you're like, I'm gonna commit to working out 3 days a week for the next year. Well, here's the problem: is that year target might be too far away. So if you're gonna work out 3 days a year, it's like subconsciously in your mind, you're basically just averaging that out. So if you miss the alarm on Wednesday, it's like, well, I worked out 2 days this week. That's pretty good. I can make up for it next week. A year from now is a long time. So you're giving yourself too much time to fail. Instead, set a 10-day goal. Don't say I'm going to work out 3 days a week for the next year. Say I'm going to get up and I'm going to go for a run, whatever it is, every morning for the next 10 mornings. Rain or shine, Monday through Sunday, I'm going to get up, I'm going to work out for the next 10 days. And all you're doing is building some momentum, right? You're just creating some energy, some inertia, right? And there's lots of little tricks that you can do. And then when that 10-day habit sticks, it's more likely that you're going to be motivated to continue it again. So now you say, okay, I'm going to peel it back. I'm going to go 5 days a week, but this is my month goal. My month goal is I'm going to work out 20 times over the next month, right? So then you miss Tuesday for whatever reason. Well, that's okay. You can make it up on Saturday. And so now you've got a smaller micro goal. Because here's the thing. It's just like we talked about yesterday. If you want life change, you have to look at it exactly as that. It has to be a lifestyle change. It can't be like, oh, I want to do this for a month. It's got to be, this is me now. This is my new normal now. Like that's why we want to make our goals about processes and not about outcomes. You don't say, I want to lose 10 pounds. You say, I want to be a healthier person. And this is part of that process of being a healthier person, right? So it's easier to give yourself that. And remember, right, progression is not linear. There's days where you're going to slip and you're going to go backwards and then you're going to climb up and then maybe you'll do well for a while and then you're going to slip again, right? So this is something that goes up and down, but you're always moving forward. It's always about the process and the progress, right? We're comparing ourselves to where we were. So 3 months from now, you only lose, 3 pounds or something like that, but you're in a better place and you're creating more healthy habits. And those results might be on the back end. So you can't measure your success based on something that's an outcome. You have to just create a lifestyle change and give yourself credit for that. And I'm gonna give you some tips for doing that today, but it's a paradigm shift. It's like we talked about yesterday. It's not like, oh, I wanna lose 3 pounds. No. Like, that's doable. It's not a bad goal to say I want to lose 3 pounds, but the idea here is you're looking at it the wrong way. I want to change my lifestyle so that I take care of myself. I want to be healthier. I want to exercise more, right? So then those action steps, look at it. So let's shift gears. I want to kind of look at, we talked about environment. I want to look at some of the brain chemistry ways to explain some of our habits, especially bad habits, right? Something that I'm seeing an increase in the prevalence of is the level of stress and anxiety that people are under now, right? We have the highest standard of living in the world. We really have the highest standard of living in the history of humanity, but we have the highest rates of generalized anxiety. We have the highest rates of panic disorder. We have the highest rates of OCD. We have all these anxiety-related disorders in our culture. And the teenage kind of range is really affected by this. So you guys know you're no stranger to this. But let's go back and review kind of how this works in your brain. Now remember, it's the hypothalamus of your limbic system that determines all of the chemicals in your bloodstream, right? But one thing about the hypothalamus, and the hypothalamus is key to homeostasis, right? That's where your sex drive originates, which is obviously an important part of continuing our species. That's where your hunger originates, which is what makes sure that you eat good food. It's where your thirst originates, so you have enough water in your cells. It's also where sleep originates. We'll talk about the hypothalamus's role in like blue light and things like that when we get to that slide. So the hypothalamus is kind of what directs homeostasis. But the downside is that it doesn't have access to the bloodstream. So we know that's what the pituitary gland is for. The hypothalamus has access to the pituitary gland, which has access to the other glands in the body. So you have these access points, right? Like, so you have the Hpa axis. That's how the hypothalamus communicates with the vagus nerve, right? Hypothalamus to pituitary to the vagus nerve. You have HPO, right? If you're a biological female, it's hypothalamus to pituitary to ovary. You have the HPG axis points, hypothalamus to pituitary to gonads if you're a biological male, right? In this case, this is the interesting one because this is the origin of sympathetic arousal, the Hpa axis. And there's been a lot of neurological research on the Hpa axis and its role in anxiety. So the Hpa axis is the connection from neurotransmitter to hormone for the release of cortisol. Cortisol from the adrenal gland. Cortisol is the hormone in the blood that we identify as stress, right? Cortisol is not a negative effect on the brain or the body. It's not negative or positive. It's just an increase in stress to prepare you for fight or flight. So for instance, if you look at it the way that certain psychologists have looked at it, you have this idea of an objective fear or a subjective fear. So let's look at the difference between fight or flight that's healthy and normal or fight or flight that we identify as anxiety. So you're walking down the street, you're going home on Shoreline after school, and then out of the woods, like this bear pops out in the sidewalk there. Well, what's happening in your brain is the amygdala has been stimulated, and it's going to create a fear response, which triggers the Hpa axis to go into gear. We need adrenaline. And then what ensues is a sympathetic response. So your pupils constrict and you begin to sweat. Your heart rate increases because we need more blood flow. Your respiration increases in your lungs because we need more oxygenation. And what's happening now is your body is preparing you to fight or to flee. In some weird example, some people will do a third option where they just freeze up, which is usually not helpful because the bear might attack you. But let's say, for instance, your body is preparing you for action. So stress is flowing through your veins. Option 1, fight the bear. Not a good option. The good news is the stressor will probably go away because you'll die pretty quickly. And so that probably would end your stress problems. But no, your natural reaction is not to overthink the situation. It's to instinctively flee. You assess the situation. I can't fight the bear, so I'm going to flee. But here's the difference between the brain's ancient HPA process versus anxiety. When you have an objective fear, which means that you're consciously aware of a very realistic chance of danger, then there's a beginning trigger for that fear, and then there's that moment where you realize you're no longer in danger. So you run away from the bear, you round a couple corners, you get back in the parking lot somewhere, and you now have realized I'm no longer in danger from the bear. And now you can begin to metabolize the molecules in your body, and your cells will calm down. But that's different because the fear came out of nowhere. It has a specific beginning, then the threat has a specific end, and that's a natural fear response in the body. You've spent just enough energy to survive, but not too much energy. But what happens if the fear is subjective? What happens if the fear is not a bear? What happens if the fear is something like a test? Well, there's no real origin to this fear trigger because you're not really afraid of the test, you're afraid of failing the test. And so when you realize that the test is imminent, then the fear response starts. So the same thing is happening. Your brain is preparing you for action, but the problem is there's no real end to the threat. Because even once you take the test, it's like you're kind of relieved, but not really, because you still don't know what you got on the test, right? And so this is a different effect on your body. It's the same chemicals, it's the same process, but the difference is the stressor is not really easy to identify. And so that's what's known as generalized anxiety. You don't have a specific trigger. It's not like a phobia. Right? If you have a specific form of anxiety, then you can identify the trigger, you can develop some coping mechanisms. But generalized anxiety is a real problem because you're creating a fight or flight response, but you don't really know exactly what for, and you don't really know when it ends. So that's problematic, right? But so how does this affect your decision making? A lot of times we make all these little micro decisions out of a stress response. We stress eat, we stress study, we cram, we stress argue, we stress drink, we stress whatever, we self-medicate. And so one of the brain chemistry ways that your decisions are influenced is by fight or flight. So identifying that as a physiological response is an important thing to do. We want to eliminate the emotional decisions, which are instinctive and reactive, like you become your mammal self at that moment. So we're not making instinctive decisions. We want to get back to the point where we're making logical, rational decisions. So when you get into arguments with people and you're in this heightened fight or flight state, that's not going to be a very logical argument, right? It's going to be a very emotional argument. And those things can be conditioned also. Right? So you have emotional arguments, and then that's just how people interact in your house, and then that's what you're learning. So that becomes a habit. And then you become defensive, and the first time somebody says something that you don't like, you go on the emotional offensive, and it's just not a healthy way to form a habit. So sometimes we make decisions out of stress. A lot of our bad habits come from dopamine, not from stress. They come from an incentivized reward. And you know that this is a complex process, right? The dopamine process is not just about reward after a behavior, but your brain is going to record that as a memory, right? So think about it this way. If the reward is not, yay, that was an awesome experience. What if the reward is just, okay, I had a desired outcome and it was achieved, right? So for instance, if dopamine is to motivate you to get resources, then that means that when you were like a cave person, it takes a lot remember, we default to complacency. So it's not an easy decision to leave the warmth and comfort of your cave to walk out against a blizzard, right, covered in your like buffalo skin, to go find the one elk for 42 miles and find a rock heavy enough to crush its skull, and then spend all the energy and calories to gut it, and then drag the thing back to your cave and cook it slowly over a smoky fire. It's like, screw all that. So there has to be some incentive to create motivation. Dopamine is motivation. And we say, oh, well, we can't maintain our new habits because I don't feel motivated. Well, what is motivation? Motivation is a reward for a successful outcome. So what if it's not an elk in the cave? What if it's you sending a message on your phone? Right? So you send a message, and then you see little dots. And then there's the anticipation of a response, and the dots go away. And the dots come back. They're typing, and then it goes on for like 5 minutes, and really they just accidentally left their keyboard up. Oops. Well, what's happening there is dopamine is anticipating a response. Because think about it this way. Let's think about it from a practical standpoint. What if the motivation behind sending a message is to get a return message? So when you see the little dots in the text thread, the dopamine is firing in your brain in anticipation for a successful outcome. So you send a message, and you get a little successful response. So now there's a reward dopamine, not because it was like super awesome that somebody texted you and you're like chemically high now. No, because you had a desired outcome and it happened. So in your mind, the brain learned this behavior works. So I'm going to repeat the behavior again, right? So what happens is now you become to anticipate that outcome. So what happens is that you lift your phone out. No. Yeah, right? It's not even so much that you're like addicted to your phone so much that like boomers love to talk about that. Like back in my day, like you guys are just so addicted to your phone. Well, the problem is that your phone is like, it's like brain addiction psychology. Like they know how to do it. They know how to get you because it works, right? So what if your goal for 2022 is you want to spend less time on social media? Well, understanding how dopamine drives your behaviors, right? So if your anticipation of an alert, a notification, is what's driving you to open the app, well, there's a simple thing that you can do. What can you do? Well, you can delete the app, or you can turn off the notifications for the app. Like, don't go so far as to like delete your whole account. You don't have to become a digital ghost and disappear your online profile, but if you're trying to make it less likely that you will subconsciously pick up your phone, open Instagram, mindlessly scroll, then create some friction. Make it so that those notifications don't entice you. Move the app into a folder. Move it to the third screen that you have to shuffle through, because you're more likely to make a subconscious instinctive decision based off past training because of dopamine. So if you look at your phone screen and you see red dots, you're going to start opening apps. Turn the notifications off. Delete the app so that you have to go on your browser. You have to go to Instagram.com. Oh, that's a lot of keystrokes. And then you have to log in. Well, that sucks. I'm not doing that anymore. So now if you want to go on Instagram, you can, but you're not going to just mindlessly open it up multiple times a day. It's just too much work. So what you're doing is you're eliminating the dopamine desire to do something that you're trying to do less of, right? So that's one way that you can break a bad habit, right? So let's look at how to create good ones though, right? Bad habits are hard to crack, right? And so we're gonna look at the same process in reverse. Like, how do we break bad habits? And it's the same process in reverse for creating good habits. Well, I use the word friction. So that comes from this book right here. This is a very readable book. If you wanna read a good book on like how to like achieve your goals, I have a friend who just has a stack of like motivational books for how to like get organized and how to like create new habits. And I'm like, well, that's ironic, right? But this is a good one. Atomic Habits. Atomic Habits, right? And this is by a guy named James Clear, who didn't really set out to write a book about habit forming. He was like a college baseball player, and he started studying entrepreneurship in college, and he started to realize that there's a lot of things that we do in consumer psychology, like why do people sign up for email lists, and why do people sign up for mailers? And so the same way that they kind of like rope you in to sell you stuff is the same way that your brain works for everything. And so he started realizing, oh, well, this is what's creating our habits. So if we know this about ourselves, then how do we break these habits? How do we break those cycles, and how do we create good habits, right? So he uses the word friction. I like this. So let's talk about diet for a second, and we'll talk about sleep in the next slide, I think. So let's say that you're trying to eat better. You're trying to create a better diet for yourself and be more healthy. Well, one of the things that you can do is you have to break your bad relationship with food, which is your dopamine desire to eat empty calories. So if you want to stop eating so many empty calories, well, you have to create friction steps between you and the junk food. So just like an alcoholic would rid the house of alcohol, you're going to rid the house of junk food. And it seems simple enough. And you say, well, coach, wait a minute, I don't buy the groceries for my house. Okay, well, you can hide them, make them less visible, less readily available. It's like the same, it's like the food and diet version of deleting the notifications or eliminating the notification. Don't make the Doritos so prominently displayed on the counter, right? Put them somewhere in the cabinet where you're gonna have to look for them, right? At some point you have to develop some willpower, yes, but it's the same thing with people who are recovering from addictions. Like if you're an alcoholic, then there's alcohol in the house, then in a moment of, weakness where you lose your self-control, you might go get in your car and drive to the liquor store and buy some whiskey. But that's multiple steps that you have to, at that point it becomes a conscious choice. If it's sitting right there in your house, there's way less friction that you have access to it, right? So this is what he talks about in the book. He talks about making lifestyle changes, which I mentioned yesterday. So it's like, okay, it's not, I want to lose 3 pounds with my diet. It's like, well, I want to eat better. I want to create a better relationship with food. I want to have better nutrition, which is going to help lots of things. It's going to help your brain chemistry. It's going to help you sleep better. It's going to help you not store so much water weight. You won't store fat in the form of sugar. You're not going to be as sluggish, right? Your immune system's going to increase. So like, just for nutritional purposes, you want to create better nutrition. Well, don't think of it as a short-term thing. think of it as a new change in your lifestyle, right? This is how I eat now. Like if you wanted to become a vegetarian, you're identifying that. You're personifying it. You're not saying I'm going to live like a vegetarian for a month. You're saying I'm going to be a vegetarian. So now you model those habits after that, right? Which is part of it. And we'll talk about identifying with your persona, right, in the next slide. Another thing I thought was interesting to take away from the book for me was he listed what he called the 4 laws of behavior change, right? And so this is like what entices you to do it. So if you want to make something like you want to eat better, okay, well you have to take food that maybe probably wasn't as enticing to you, and you have to create a cue. So he talks about in all behaviors, the first step is you have a cue, right? And so the cue is to let me see it. And the example he gives in the book is like fruits and vegetables. Like if you know you're going to walk into the kitchen and you know you're going to do it for the purpose of snacking. So make apples readily available in your kitchen. You'd be more likely to eat an apple if it's just sitting there in a bowl, right? So make something obvious. Create a cue, right? He said the same thing is like when you brush your teeth. Like what happens is your toothbrush is visible, it's available, it's in this cup right by your sink. You walk in the bathroom and you see it, so it triggers a thought. Right? It's more likely to continue that behavior because it's right there, it's obvious. The second part is the craving, right? The packaging matters, right? Doritos look really enticing, you know, Chips Ahoy cookies look really enticing. It's like big red bright packaging, like giant cookies blown up on there, right? They don't just put it in dull packaging, like that matters. Right? So you want to create something and make it look good. If you're trying to eat better quality food, presentation matters, right? Cook it. Cook it in a way that smells good, that looks delicious. Cook it with other things that you like. Add multiple flavor profiles to it, right? Go to some trouble to make it an attractive thing to eat, right? You got to eat more salad, and you're trying to figure out a way to make the salad enticing. Well, put some salmon in the salad or something like that. Add something that you like, right? Make it an attractive thing so that you're not dreading doing it, right? Make it easy to get. Right? So for instance, let's take just step away from diet for a second. What if you're trying to exercise? Okay? Well, making it obvious would be like lay your exercise clothes out the night before you get up. Which, by the way, you should have exercise clothes. One of the other psychological sciences that people think is there's a cognitive advantage to dressing the part. So have a uniform, he says. Like if you're going to work out, especially at home, get a workout outfit. Or several, but that's your uniform because when you change clothes, you're much more likely to actually participate in the behavior. And the same thing is true in reverse. Like change back into your regular clothes afterwards, right? If I come home from work and I don't want to take the stress of my day home with me, I'm going to change out of my work clothes and then into just lounge clothes and then go play with the kids and the dog or whatever, right? So that's the cue. Make it obvious. Create your workout clothes right next to you when you go to sleep. But what does it look like to make it attractive? Well, make it an enticing thing to do. Maybe you don't like to run. Well, it's not likely you're going to continue to exercise if you don't enjoy running. So maybe you'd rather swim. Okay, put your swimsuit out there. You're going to go swimming in the morning, right? But here's the thing. You have to make it easy. What if you're like, okay, I'm going to really enjoy swimming in the ocean because it's going to be cathartic and it's going to be like nature and it's going to help my mental well-being. And it does. But think about the likelihood that you're going to drive through several stoplights and over a bridge and then park to go swim in the ocean. You're not going to do that as often as if you lived at the beach or you swim in a pool that's in your backyard. So again, making it easy to do is a big part of building a habit, right? It has to be something that doesn't require a lot of steps. It's like that alcoholic in reverse, right? If you make it too difficult, too many action steps for you to participate in the behavior, you're probably not going to repeat it too many times. Right? And finally, make it satisfying. Make it something that's rewarding, right? And maybe add some conditioning in there, right? So every time you go for a jog, you're going to stop and get a smoothie, right? So you're going to reward yourself, and that's something that you do, right? So just keep that in mind. And if you want to break those habits, it's the opposite, right? Those cookies are too visible. Make them less obvious. Make them less attractive. Take them out of the big red packaging and put them in a Ziploc bag. Like, it's weird, like when you look at things like chips. When you take chips out of their bag and put them in Ziploc bags, you see like the grease and the like little crumbs. They're just not that appealing looking. They look old and stale, right? So make them less attractive to eat. Put them in the back so you're like, oh, I wonder how long those chips have been there, right? Make them harder to get to. right? Not only do we not see them right away when we go into the kitchen, we're going to put them behind two things inside of the cabinet. So it's like if you want chips, you got to really go looking for them, right? And if it's satisfying to eat chips, somehow make it unsatisfying to do. I don't know. Maybe it's like aversive conditioning. I don't know. But building a habit is the same thing as breaking a habit in reverse, right? So that's Atomic Habits if you want to read. Another thing that I took away, and this may work for you, right, is this idea of identification. One thing that he talks about in the book is identify rather than do. So you want to create this persona where this is your personality now, right? So instead of saying like, I'm going to run 3 days a week, you're going to start identifying as a runner. And believe it or not, that makes a big difference, right? Because now if you're a person who's a runner, you're going to identify with that persona. You're going to make that part of your personality. You're probably more likely to do the things that go along with that, right? So habits form from our identification. If you make a commitment to be like a gym shark, you got to look the part. You got to personify with it, right? You got to talk to everybody you can about CrossFit. And you got to put like, Spartan stickers on the back of your truck. And you got to carry around water for some reason. You got to put like really skimpy sleeveless shirts even though you weigh 120 pounds. And you got to talk to everybody you can about your new chubby shorts, right? Like this is your identity. This is who you are. So nothing, really nothing. That's a personification, right? Of somebody who is a gym shark, right? You're creating this persona. You're identifying with it. And maybe it's not that extreme. Maybe it's just you're an athlete, right? Now you identify yourself as a basketball player. So I'm a basketball player. I'm going to go after school. I'm going to shoot hoops in the gym. Why? Because that's what basketball players do, right? Well, I'm going to go work out before school. Why? Because that's what athletes do, right? You're creating this, not even so much a title, you're creating this responsibility for yourself, right? And then you're going to hang around with other people who do that, and it's going to make the habit more likely. You're going to establish routines. And then that 10-day goal is going to turn into a 4-week goal or turn into a 10-month goal, right? So there's lots of different ways that you can create positive habits. And this is just one. Again, we're going to write it down. We're going to make it exist, like we're manifesting it, right? Write it down. We're going to create little tiny micro decisions, right? Evaluate the causes of what causes us to make these decisions, right? What are the environmental things that affect my decisions and my habits? What are the brain chemistry ways where I'm being enticed for these habits? What are the genetics that I have to combat? What friction can I create to eliminate those bad habits, right? How do I make it less appealing? So the same thing is true in reverse. If you want to make a habit stick, you have to really commit to it. You have to personify with it. Because again, it's about lifestyle change. It's not just about doing something different. It's about being a different person. So again, I'm an athlete. Athletes don't miss workouts. So you're identifying, you're personifying, right? Now, we talked about diet. We talked about exercise a little bit. Let's talk about sleep. Because I think there's other aspects to sleep, right? So there you go, right? Sleep is affected by environmental things too. It's affected by genetics, like you might have some level of insomnia that you inherit from your parents. And you have to understand the brain chemistry sides of sleep also. Right? Sleep comes from a hormone called melatonin. And melatonin is produced by a nucleus in the hypothalamus called the pineal gland, the P. The pineal gland creates and secretes melatonin, which causes your body to calm down and relax. But the part of your hypothalamus that communicates with the pineal gland is a nucleus that determines if it's daytime or if it's nighttime. It's known as the SCN, suprachiasmatic nucleus. You'll see that in chapter 5. The SCN determines if it's daytime, we block the production of melatonin. If it's nighttime, we stimulate the release of melatonin, right? That's why people who are blind, they struggle with things like non-24 disease. Like they have a hard time determining day from night, and they release melatonin at inappropriate times. Or if you have narcolepsy and you fall asleep at random times. People who work night shifts, they have to shift their circadian rhythms because they're used to being awake at night and asleep during the day. So there's a couple things about sleep you have to know from a brain chemistry standpoint, right? One of the things I can tell you, and if you babysit little kids, I have little kids, I can tell you this works, is like routine matters. Routine matters to get ready to work out. Routine matters to get ready to read. Routine matters to get ready to study. Routine matters to get ready to go to sleep. You have to have a routine, and you establish that routine. And it might be, again, just like you're going to gear up to work out, you're going to gear up to go to sleep. So your routine is, I'm going to put on my sleep clothes. Your routine is, I'm going to like head up to bed and read for 20 minutes and then lay down, right? You have to establish a routine and perpetuate the routine. This is like the single greatest thing that keeps my terrorists from like tearing the house apart. They've established the routine and they're trained. They don't want to go to bed. They wouldn't voluntarily go to bed, but they're trained. They go to bed because we start the routine and the routine stays the same, and that consistency is something that they're used to. So you can do that for yourself. Create a routine, right? This is a big one. How much of your environment is affecting your sleep? Change that. A lot of people tell me, they're like, oh, I can only go to sleep with the TV on. And I'm like, that's actually biologically the opposite of the truth. Now, you might be so exhausted that the TV is distracting your racing mind enough to actually make you fall asleep, but that's a totally different deal. You don't need light to go to sleep. Quite the opposite, you need dark. If that's where you're at, it's because you have something else going on in your brain, like your mind's probably racing or you've had too much caffeine, right? But it's not like you lay in the dark in the silence and you won't fall asleep, right? Maybe you have some level of anxiety if that's the case, right? But in a natural setting, the environment has a lot to do, right? So again, if we're going to change the environment to work out, and I've got my workout outfit, I'm going to go out to the garage, that's where the workouts happen, we've put ourselves in that scene. He says the same thing about sleep. But also, something I didn't mention is he says that about like, well, if you're going to read at your house, don't read in your bed because you're going to fall asleep. And don't read where you watch TV because you're going to be tempted to watch TV. Create a space that's devoted to that. Get a comfy chair, get a comfy blanket, get some nice light, and that's your reading spot, right? The same thing is true with sleep. Don't do all these things at once in your bed, which is what all of you do. You study in your bed, you listen to music in your bed, you watch TV in your bed, you cuddle with your cat in your bed, right? Your bed is for sleeping, right? You need to create this space where this is a sanctuary for sleeping, right? So changing the environment matters. Eliminating distractions, which you know, but it's something you have to put into practice, right? If you have alerts going on in your phone, if your phone is not in night mode, if your phone is sitting next to your bed, it'll light up when you get notifications. And you're like, oh, well, I use my phone for my alarm, coach. Well, buy an alarm. Alarm clocks are like $4. Okay, buy an alarm clock. Put your phone somewhere else, even if it's in your room. Put it face down, charging on your nightstand. Because if you get up to like go pee in the middle of the night, you're gonna check your phone, even if it's in night mode. So put your phone in night mode, put it somewhere else away from your arm's reach, create some friction. So if you're gonna pick up your phone, you gotta get up out of bed, walk across the floor, flip the screen over, right? Which you still will do, but it's less likely that you're gonna do it as often as if it's right next to you, right? So eliminate distractions. Limit your liquid intake. You'd be shocked at how late you drink lots of fluids, which is gonna make it more likely that you have to urinate, which is gonna keep you awake, right? Also, caffeine. If you have a normal resting heart rate, it takes about 4 hours for caffeine to fully leave the bloodstream. So if you're going to plan to go to bed at 11, don't drink the soda at 8 p.m., right? You're still going to have caffeine kind of residually in your bloodstream after that, right? And begin your day early. And this is a good one, right? That'll make you go to sleep because you'll be tired. Right? All right, so tomorrow we'll look at mental sins.